Now, in today's video, we're going to be talking about what I feel is the most important part of building no-code apps, and that is the state. And so in today's video, we are going to be discussing the almighty state when it comes to building apps with FlutterFlow. And by the end of the video, you will learn how to build more robust and easier to use apps than ever before. Now, before we get started, as always, all the apps and all the resources that I demonstrate on this channel are going to be available to view and or clone from my Patreon page. And you can learn more about our amazing Patreon community using the link in the description below the video. Now, what exactly is app state? Okay, so here we have a very simple diagram that aims to explain exactly how everything kind of comes together. Okay, so here we have a user and here we have the UI, and this is the part where the user interacts with your app. Okay, now behind the UI you're gonna have a logic layer, and this is where all the calculations, all the business logic, all the little tweaks, the rules, the various conditions are going to be coded. And here at the backend, you have your database and backend, and this is a very simple layer. This is essentially where your data is going to be stored, and so essentially your app is going to be reading and writing that data. Okay, and typically this is going to be like things like Firestore from Firebase, or Supabase, or something else. Okay, now what ties everything together is something called a state. Okay, we can also call it application state. Okay, app state is very important, and I like to call application state kind of like the bloodline of your app. Okay, so just like with the human body, you have the blood that constantly shuttles different nutrients into the body and then takes the waste out of the body. This is exactly what app state is. It kind of connects everything together, and it serves lots of different uses. And in fact, if you do not understand app state very well, and you do not know how to leverage it when it comes to building just about any kind of app, from very simple app to very complex app, not only is it going to take you a lot more time to build the same app that you could have built a lot faster, but you're also going to struggle a lot more, and your app is also not going to be as reactive, because app state can make your app a lot more reactive. Okay, so app state is very important, and instead of kind of talking about it here theoretically and looking at diagrams, let's go ahead and jump into a FlutterFlow proof of concept app that shows you how you can leverage different levels of app state wizardry in order to make your app a lot more robust and easier to use. All right, so here I am inside of FlutterFlow, which is my favorite no-code builder of choice, and I'm going to be showing you progressively more and more powerful techniques that you can leverage with app state. All right, so in this first demo, I want to show you a quintessential example when you're going to be using app state. And that is when you're going to be building something like a shopping cart. Okay, so in this first page we have here, we have a very simple shopping cart that uses app state combined with a data type that lists 3 products here with a bunch of different attributes. So we have the name of the product, we have the quantity here, and we have the price of this product. So let's go back into FlutterFlow and let me show you how we have implemented that. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a data type. Okay, in order to hold different fields that are kind of bound together. Okay, so if we go here in this data types, we have this data type called item type, and we have a bunch of fields for this data type. So we have things like name, price, quantity, and check delete, which is going to dictate if you want to delete that item, and that is something I'm going to cover a little bit later. Okay, the next thing you want to do is you want to go to this app state here, and you want to use that data type here to create an app state variable, right? And the way you do it is you click here and you call it something. So let's say list of products or shopping cart if you want. Here you go pick data type, you select your item type, and then you want to make sure that you select is list, because this is essentially a list of these products. If you do not select list, you're just going to have one product, right? And that's not going to be a shopping cart. Okay. And that is exactly what I did here. And the next thing that I did is that I initialized 3 of these products here. So we're not starting off with an empty app state. Okay. Although that could be a possibility in some situations. Here we have created this app state variable, but we also initialized it to 3 kind of random products, right? So we have 3 products here, and this is the first product. This is a Sony a6400 camera. This is a price and quantity. And then we have another product. This is an iPhone 15 Pro Max, price and quantity. And last but not least, we have another product, which is a laptop here, MacBook M1 Pro 14-inch. It's $2,000 and the quantity is 1. Okay, so we have 3 products that we're starting off with. Of course, if you're going to be building a production app, you're going to be loading this data from somewhere, right? You're not going to be, you're not going to be creating just random products. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I am basically skipping that step. Okay, I'm basically showing you once you have some of these products loaded into app state. And once you have your app state loaded, you can simply display them here. So I have a list view. And then what I'm doing here is I'm generating dynamic children. I'm just specifying my app state here. And I have my items here. And then for each item, essentially, I am using this data structure field, right? Remember, because we have this custom data structure. So I'm pulling in the specific field and displaying it here. So in this case, this is name. This is going to be, quantity, right? We have quantity here, and then we have price here, okay? So very, very simple. I know many of you have probably built such a page before. I know I have when I build all kinds of different apps that use this shopping cart. So now let's go ahead and let me show you a more advanced example here, okay? So if we go to the second page right here, what we have here is we have a shopping cart, but you can also select different items, and that could be, useful if you want to delete them, right? So you can click here and that's going to delete it. But let's say you want to select multiple items, okay? And as you can see, this thing here, this button appears when we select at least one item, and if we deselect it, it disappears, okay? So there's lots of things happening here, but what I want you guys to notice is that this value here, this one here, and this 2, this is also app state, except in this case, this is page state, okay? And the difference between app state and page state is that app state is throughout the app, right? This is the state that's available throughout the app, whereas page state is only available on a certain page, okay? And so this is a good idea to do when you don't want to pollute your app state variables, right? If you have a variable that's only going to be available on one page, on that specific page, use page state. And so what's happening here is that not only are we displaying this button here when we select something, but we are also displaying this number. So if I select 2, you see that 2 is over here. If I select 3, that 3 is over there. So there's a couple of things happening here. Yes, the button appears, if we select something, because if we do not select anything, there's no need for the button to be seen. But there's another thing that's happening here is that this thing is automatically rebuilt, right? You see how this went from 1 to 2, now this goes from 2 to 3. It's automatically getting rebuilt, and that's because app state is integral to making your app reactive, right? This is reactive. You see how you click on something and you're getting a change. This is called reactive development, and you always want to strive for your app to be as reactive as possible. And so if you think about it, I could have left this out, right? I could have left this number out. So I could have just had a button that says delete. And so regardless of whether I had 1 checkbox or 2 or 3, this button would not change. But I decided to make it a little bit more interesting by leveraging some of the reactive techniques here, okay? And that's with the help of app state. So let me show you how you can do that. So let's go back here. That is the second page right here. And this is all the same, except if you go to the top level of this page and you click here on page state, I have a page state variable that's only available on this page here. So only on shopping cart 2, I have a separate page state variable. And here's where I'm tracking the number of items, right? I have num checked, which is an integer, and I am tracking the number of times that I've selected. So if I selected 1, you know, this value is going to be 1. If I selected 2, it's going to be 2. If I deselect something or unselect something, it's going to decrement, it's going to go back to 1. So how is this happening? Well, if you select this checkbox here, this checkbox has an action, right? If you go back here, we open it up. So I have an action on untoggled on and untoggled off, right? So if we go to untoggled on, what am I doing? I'm incrementing this num checked page state variable. If you go to untoggled off, I'm decrementing it by specifying a negative value. Okay, so as the user is checking various checkboxes, that value is dynamically getting rebuilt. Now, there's something else that's very, very important to understand. When I am working with this page state or app state, doesn't matter. In this case, this is page state. You want to make sure that you have this properly selected. And remember, I have this value that is, you know, dynamically being rebuilt or refreshed. And so if you go back here, I want to make sure that I have this selected. If I have this selected, no rebuild, then that button is not going to change. It's always going to be that same value, okay? Whereas if I have this here, anytime I change this, you know, anytime I deselect or select a checkbox, it's automatically going to rebuild the entire page. And that is why that button is going to have a new value, is going to have a new label. And the same thing is happening here. We have rebuild current page. Okay, so as you might have noticed, page state and app state is not just for keeping track of various variables, although that is very, very important. It's equally valuable when it comes to actually, you know, displaying various dynamic data, you know, reactive programming. And you're going to see that in some of the other examples right now, okay? Now, if you look in this demo right here, while we can select different checkboxes and we have the number of checkboxes being reflected here, the problem with this demo is that it's not actually setting the individual item to be deleted, right? These checkboxes are not connected to any of the items. These are just random checkboxes that I'm just listing on each of these items. So if I were to click this button, the app would not know which one of these elements to delete. And that is because this checkbox here is not actually tied to a specific element. Now, if you recall on this data type here, this item type, I have name, price, and quantity, but I also have another field here, which is a Boolean, meaning that is a true or false, that will determine whether I want to delete that specific item from the shopping cart, right? So if you go back here, it would be ideal to link these together. And that is exactly what I'm doing right here. So if we go to this next demo here, if you click on this, you see how it automatically selects all of these, right? And in this case, when you click on this select all items, we are actually setting the specific field for each of these items, right? So if you were going to click on delete all, it would know, you know, which items to delete or not, because in this case, all of these items are going to be marked for deletion. Now I can also click here and I just toggle them off. And now we don't have the button, and also the items are no longer displayed to be marked for deletion, right? Whereas if I click here, now these items are marked for deletion. And that is because you can see that the items are in italic and there's also a strike through here. So if I were going to click delete all and I was going to actually create the logic that would actually go ahead and delete these items, that would be very, very trivial, because now each of these items has an associated field that's automatically marked whenever I click this item, right? So let me show you how that is done. So let's go back to our page here. This is this third demo right here. And how is this implemented? Well, if we click on this checkbox right here and we open up our actions panel, we have untoggled on and untoggled off, and the flows are almost exactly the same, except that untoggled on, we are setting those items to be marked for deletion, whereas untoggled off, we are setting them to be marked not for deletion. And so if I click on untoggled on, what we have here is we have a loop that essentially loops through all the items in our app state, and for each of the item, it sets that check delete as true. And that is exactly what it's doing, right? So we have this loop condition where the loop index is less number of items, and then we are updating each item here. And here we are incrementing the loop index. And what is a loop index? Well, a loop index is actually a page state variable, right? And anytime you're going to be building these kinds of loops, and that is going to be the case whenever you need to modify multiple items. So if you have a list of products that's being used as a shopping cart, you will need to create a loop, and you're going to be using a loop index. So here I have a loop index, which is just an integer, and the initial value is 0, right? You want to make sure you initialize it, okay? So if we go back here, you click this, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm setting it to 0. I'm resetting the value, because anytime I click on it, if I go back here, I need to make sure that value is 0 again. So before I start my loop, you want to make sure that you reset the value. This is good practice, okay? So I'm resetting the value back to 0. And here, like I explained, we have a condition, and you're going to have the exact same condition. Loop index, this loop index, is less than the number of list items. And what is this number of items? It's just the number of items in this shopping cart, which is a list of products that we are storing, okay? And so as we are looping here for each of the items, we are updating item and the index. We're, finding that specific item using this loop index. And the only thing we're doing is we're updating one field. You can update multiple fields if you want, but it doesn't really make sense to update the name, the price, the quantity, or anything like that when you really need to update the check delete, okay? So I'm making it true here. And in this case, on toggled off, I'm doing the exact opposite. So here I'm setting it false. Now, another thing that I'm doing is I also have conditional visibility for some of the widgets. I'm using a stack, and inside the stack, I have 2 rows that are going to be displayed conditionally, depending on what's happening. So I have row enabled, row disabled. Row disabled is going to display it using this kind of format, so italics and strike through, whereas enabled is going to be like this, okay? And so if you take a look at this row enabled, it's just standard, right? So if you come in here, row enabled, we have here a condition that says that cart item check delete, but we're using the opposite, which means that check delete is false, which means that that item was not marked for deletion, okay? Whereas here, check delete is true, right? So we're not setting this, we're just, setting it, we're just checking if it's check delete, which means it's true, okay? And so what makes this little demo here different than this one is that in this case, all we are doing is we're just tracking the number of times, I have these items selected. Whereas here, we are actually setting these delete fields to be true on a specific app state product, right? So this is actually being done on the app state. This is not just a count of, items or anything like that. This is actually being done on the app state. And last but not least, we have this button. And how do we know when we need to display this button? Well, we need to be displaying this button when there's at least one item here that's marked for deletion, which means that there's at least one item where check delete is true, okay? That is when we need to display this button. If you take a look here, we have a conditional here. And what we are doing is we are doing a filter and we're checking. We're essentially telling FlutterFlow, give us all the items where check delete is true, and then tell us just the number of items. Like, I don't care about the specific items. I just want a count. So if there's, 5 items, don't give me the items, just tell me 5. If there's 1 item, I don't care about the item. I just tell me that there's 1 item, right? Just give me the value. And what I'm doing here is I'm getting the number of values where, that are marked for deletion, and I'm asking it to compare it to 0. And if it's greater than 0, that means we need to display this button, because that means that at least 1 item has been marked for deletion. And so unlike with the previous case where we are just, working with, a separate page state variable, in this case, we are actually working with the app state together, right? We don't have a separate page state variable except that loop index, which is something you're going to have anyway. But other than that, we're working directly with the app state. And so everything is completely reactive. There's immediate reaction as to what's happening. Not only all of these are marked for deletion, but we have this button here. And if we were to define the logic for this button, we would know exactly which one of the items that are marked for deletion, that, the items that we actually need to delete. So This is the ultimate way of doing it. But that is actually not all. You can take this app state reactivity techniques to another level and make your app a lot more user-friendly and robust. So let's go ahead to this next page right here. And on this page, not only do we still have this logic that marks these items for deletion, but in this case, we can also update the quantity as well. So let's say you have a shopping cart here, and you want your user to update the quantity. So as you can see right now, we have a quantity of 1 for each of these items. But let's say you want to purchase 2 of these Sonyas. So I'm going to change this to 2, press enter. And not only did we update the price automatically, but we also updated the total quantity here, right? I can do the same thing here. Let's say I change that to 3. Now it's 3,000 and we have total quantity of 6. So that's 2 plus 3 plus 1. Let's say I want to buy 5 MacBooks, press enter. We've updated this and we've updated the quantity as well. Now let's go ahead to this 4th page here and let me show you how this is implemented. Now, because we have a field here that takes an input, that is called a dynamic field. And in FlutterFlow, anytime you have a widget that takes an input, and in other words, this widget can dynamically change its value, during runtime, you have to wrap that widget in a component. Okay, so you cannot have just, like a text input field all by itself on this page. You have to wrap it in a component. Okay, so here I have a component that I essentially wrapped a text input field. So essentially what I did was I went here, type text, and added this text field here. Okay, and as soon as I did that, I have this error, right? It's telling me text field widget with the current config will not function properly when generated dynamically at the moment, right? And that is because this is a dynamic field. It's taking an input. It's not a text field here. It's not a text widget. It's actually a text field that takes a value from the user. And so the next thing that you can do is you can right click and you can convert it to a component. That is exactly what I did. And this is the result. So we have this component here, and essentially a component is essentially a subset of your app that has its own state, its own variables, its own parameters, etc., etc. So if we select this component here and you click on this edit right here, edit this component, you're going to see this component right here, and this component only has one field. And in this case, we are essentially passing various parameters to this component, right? So if I go back here to this component here, we are passing 2 parameters. First, we're passing the quantity, right? So that when the app loads, we can display that quantity as the default field in that component. But remember, we are not only going to be displaying the quantity, we're also going to be taking input from the user, and we're going to be updating our app state in order to update everything else on the page. Okay, because if we are not updating app state, we won't be able to recalculate everything else. Remember, we also had that number of total quantities, we had the price. In order to recalculate all that automatically, remember reactive programming and all that, we need to update app state then and there. And in order to update this app state, we also need to pass in the item index, because the way that this is going to work is that not only will that component display something, but when the user enters a new value, we're going to be updating that app state from this component here. And as a result of updating that app state, everything else is going to be rebuilt and refreshed and recalculated automatically. And so remember, we have this quantity, and that enables us to display the initial quantity, but we also have the item index that allows us to figure out which item to update based on its index, right? And what is this item index? Well, if you go back here, we have this list, and when you have a list, you automatically have a variable that's provided by FlutterFlow that you can kind of pass around, and that's going to be the item index, right? And it's typically indexed from 0. So this is going to be item index 0, this is item index 1, item index 2, and item index 3. Okay, so depending on which values that you're working with, your system, your app will know exactly what we're dealing with here. And because we know the item index, we can find that item in the app state and we can modify it, we can do whatever we want with it once we have this item index, okay? So if we go back to this component, the first thing that we need to do is we need to define various parameters for this component. And we've done that here. And now when the app is running, what we can do is we can pass these parameters into the component. So we're passing the quantity from the main page, right? From the main page as that quantity being displayed, but we're also passing this index here. And then inside of this component, remember, we just have a text field. It's just a regular widget. This is this input field here. We have an action here, right? We're going to open this up, and on submit, we're updating this app state. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're taking this app state that's available throughout the app here, and we're simply updating item at index, right? We're specifying this item index that was passed as a parameter. And here we're updating the quantity because that specific input field has to do with the quantity. You know, we're not updating the name, we're not updating the description, we're updating the quantity. And so here we're just setting the value using the input quantity field that's in that specific component here. And right here, this is one of the most important things here, right? You want to make sure you get this right. Remember, because we have so many things happening here, right? So if I change this to 10, you know, we're updating this, we're updating this. You want to make sure that you don't only use rebuild current component, okay? Because we don't want to just rebuild the current component. We want to rebuild the containing page, right? We want to rebuild everything in that page from where the component was launched from, okay? So if we come over here, we want to rebuild this page. We don't really need to rebuild the other pages in this specific case. And so you also have an option to do that, rebuild all pages. We don't really need to do that, but we do need to rebuild the containing page, the hosted page of this component. So here's the component. We need to rebuild this whole page because it's reactive, right? We're letting the user know as they're, you know, changing some of the variables. We're telling them what's happening, right? We're making the app, you know, more user-friendly. We're making the app more robust because we want the user to know, oh, you have 18 items in your shopping cart. Maybe that's too much. Did you realize you have 18 items? Maybe they have a, you know, maybe they have a shopping cart with like 20 products and they just updated a couple of, you know, quantities. And now they have, you know, 30 different quantities of products. Maybe, you know, maybe they don't want to do that, right? So maybe they're going to set it to 1. And now the price is 500. Now this is down from 18 to 9. Okay. So if you want this kind of behavior, you need to be working with app state, which is exactly what we're doing here. And in this case, we have an extra level of complexity because inside of this list widget here, remember, this is just a simple list view here, right? We also have a field that takes an input. And that is why we need to wrap that field in its own component and pass a bunch of values in there and have that component itself work with the app state. And then after it modifies the app state, everything can be rebuilt. And as a result, you see all the updated values. And this is the pattern that you want to be leveraging when you're building your reactive apps. Now, to close this off, I want to show you one more example that you can leverage in your apps anytime you have this specific use case. So let me show you this demo right here. So if I click on this page, it says here loading data. So we need to wait a couple of seconds. And once a certain number of seconds pass, it finally loads this data and displays it here. So let me show you exactly how this was built, and then I'll explain some very, very common use cases as to why you want to be leveraging this exact technique here, this exact pattern here. So this is this last page here. This is demo 5. And what's happening here, when the user navigates to this page, we have here a delay, and this delay represents some kind of a long-running calculation. So maybe you need to get some data from a cloud function. Maybe you're making an API call. Maybe, you know, you need to do something else. In other words, there is a delay, right? And because there is a delay, you can't really display this data right away. Because if you were going to display this data, right, that you're waiting on, you're going to have an empty page. And when the data comes, you're still going to have an empty page. And the way that you can solve this problem very, very elegantly is, well, you guessed it, by using app state. And in this case, we're using page state because we only care about the specific technique on this page here. Okay, so once the user navigates to this page, in this action, we wait 5 seconds, which simulates some kind of a long-running action, like I mentioned. And then what we're doing is we're updating our page state. And once this page state is updated, it's automatically displayed on this page, and the page rebuilds itself and the user sees the content, right? So if you come over here, we have this update page state. And what is this page state in this case? Well, it's actually very simple. It's essentially a list of strings. In this case, it's a list of cities. And so if we go back to this action here and we open it up, what we're doing is we are setting that app state with a bunch of values. In this case, it's a bunch of cities. I'm using a code expression, and this code expression returns a list of cities. So I'm returning, a list of strings consisting of things like Los Angeles, New York, Miami, San Diego, and Seattle. Okay, it's just a list of strings, but you can potentially return just about anything depending on what your app needs. It could be a list of custom data types, a list of numbers, you name it, right? Typically, it's going to be a list of custom data types because you're going to be displaying maybe a list of something, but it could be just about anything. And so once we set this page state, we also need to make sure that our update type is set to rebuild current page, because if you have no rebuild, you're not going to have that reactive behavior. So we're saying rebuild current page. And so when that page state is set, it's automatically going to rebuild it. And here again, I have this conditional view using a stack. I have a list view that's only going to be displayed once that page state has at least one item, right? So I have num list items, which is this thing right here, which is this page state. So as soon as our page state has at least one item, we want to display it. If it doesn't have it, what we're doing is we're displaying this container here, num list items is 0, and this container just says loading data. So let me go ahead and disable this, and you can see that. So by default, before that data is actually finished, calculating, before we actually get this data, whatever we were doing, right, there's some long running calculation. It's going to take more than a second. If it's going to take more than a second, you need to be using this technique, because you can't display this data right away, because when this page loads, that data is not ready yet. Okay, so you need to be using this technique. And so as a result, this is being displayed first. And then when that data comes back, our page state is updated, the page is rebuilt, and automatically all the data shows. So just like I said, this is an awesome technique. When it comes to displaying data, that may take a couple of seconds or more. So at least a couple of seconds for the data to be available, and you want to display to the user. So you can have some kind of a display that tells them loading data. And then once the data comes in, you can swap that for the list view and display the list view, because once the page state is set, that page is going to be automatically rebuilt. And obviously all of these examples are just that. They are examples of how you can use app state and page state to make your app easier to use and more robust and more reactive, which is, what users like. They want to see things happening on their app without needing to click buttons and refresh the page and kind of navigate it to one page or another. They want to see things happening as a result of them having to take a certain action right then and there. And so if you were building apps, but maybe you have been using page state or app state here and there, but you haven't been using it to the fullest, then some of the things that I talked about here are going to be very, very helpful. And the best way to leverage the things that I talked about here is being able to view and or clone this app. And you can do just that from our amazing Patreon community. And remember, when you join our amazing Patreon community, not only will you be able to view and or clone this app right here, but you'll also be able to view and or clone over 150 apps that I built on this channel. They're all there, and I built apps that do just about anything in all kinds of different niches, leveraging all kinds of amazing FlutterFlow techniques. So if you're building any kind of app right now, or you're planning to build an app in the future, then you definitely need to join our amazing Patreon community in order to take your no-code knowledge to the next level. Plus, When you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to get access to extra content such as Q&As, live streams, behind the scenes content, and our amazing masterclass series where I do a deep dive on topics that the community votes on. Plus, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting this channel and supporting my work, and that is greatly appreciated. So if you've been watching this channel but you're not yet a member, then you're definitely missing out. So make sure you check out our amazing Patreon community and consider becoming a member. You can learn more about it using the link in the description below the video.